Elena Kozlov grew up in the small mountain village of Volkov, where her father taught her to hunt before she could properly tie her shoes. The old man had fought in 3 wars and knew the value of a steady hand and patient heart. Every morning before dawn, he would wake his daughter and lead her into the dense forests that surrounded their home. "Shooting is not about the gun," her father would whisper as they crouched behind fallen logs, watching deer graze in distant meadows. "It is about understanding wind, distance, and timing. Most importantly, it is about respect for life and death." Elena absorbed these lessons like dry earth soaks up rain. By age 12, she could hit a playing card at 200 meters. By 15, she was out shooting grown men at the village competitions. The local hunters would shake their heads in amazement as this quiet girl with braided hair consistently placed shots that seasoned marksmen could only dream of. Her village sat near the border, a place where tensions had simmered for generations. The mountains had seen countless conflicts, and everyone knew that peace was often just a temporary pause between wars. Elena's father had lost his leg in the last border skirmish, and her older brother Pavel served in the National Guard unit stationed 20 kilometers away. When Elena turned 18, the regional conflict that everyone had been dreading finally erupted. Enemy forces pushed across the border in a coordinated assault, overwhelming the scattered guard posts. Within 48 hours, they had advanced deep into the territory, forcing thousands of civilians to flee their homes. Pavel's unit was among the first to engage the invaders. Elena received word that her brother's outpost had been overrun, with only a handful of survivors managing to escape into the mountains. The enemy was now less than 30 kilometers from Volkov, and refugees streamed through the village daily, carrying stories of burned homes and captured soldiers. Elena's father gathered the village council in their small community center. The building, which usually hosted wedding celebrations and harvest festivals, now buzzed with urgent whispers about evacuation routes and hidden supplies. Most families were preparing to flee deeper into the mountains, but Elena's father had a different idea. "We know these peaks better than any outsider," he told the assembled villagers. "This is our home. Some of us should stay and make the invaders pay for every meter they try to take." Elena volunteered immediately, despite her father's protests. She had inherited not only his shooting skills but also his stubborn determination. A dozen other villagers agreed to stay, mostly older men who had fought in previous conflicts. They looked at Elena with a mixture of admiration and concern. She was clearly their best marksman, but she was also the youngest among them. The group spent 3 days preparing defensive positions throughout the mountain passes. Elena's father, despite his injured leg, proved invaluable in selecting locations that offered both concealment and clear fields of fire. They cached ammunition and supplies in hidden spots, creating a network of positions that would allow them to harass enemy forces while remaining mobile. Elena chose her primary position on a rocky outcrop called Eagle's Perch, nearly 800 meters above the main road that led through the pass. The location offered an unobstructed view of the entire valley approach, with multiple escape routes leading deeper into the mountains. Her father helped her construct a camouflaged hide using local rocks and vegetation. "Remember everything I taught you," he said as they worked together, piling stones to create a stable shooting rest. "Patience wins more battles than courage. Wait for the right moment, take your shot, and disappear before they know where it came from." Elena nodded, checking her rifle for the 100th time. It was an older model, inherited from her grandfather, but she knew every scratch and quirk of the weapon. She had hand-loaded her ammunition, carefully measuring each powder charge to ensure consistent performance. Everything had to be perfect. There would be no room for mistakes. On the 4th morning, scouts reported enemy vehicles moving up the mountain road. Elena took her position at Eagle's Perch before sunrise, settling into the rocky hide with her rifle and enough supplies for 2 days. The other villagers were spread throughout the pass, each responsible for their assigned sector. Through her scope, Elena could see the main road winding through the valley below. At this distance, vehicles would look like toys and people would appear as tiny figures. She had practiced at these ranges countless times, but never with human targets. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Shooting was about respect for life and death. The first enemy column appeared around noon. 3 armored vehicles followed by several trucks filled with soldiers. Elena estimated their strength at roughly 50 men, a significant force for a mountain pass but not overwhelming for defenders who knew the terrain. She watched through her scope as they approached the village, noting their formation and equipment. The enemy soldiers moved with confidence, clearly not expecting resistance in this remote area. They had underestimated the mountain people, assuming that civilians would simply flee rather than fight. Elena could see officers pointing at maps and gesturing toward various positions, apparently planning to establish a permanent base in the pass. As the convoy reached the center of the village, Elena's radio crackled with her father's voice. "All units, prepare to engage on my signal." She adjusted her scope for the range and wind conditions, settling her crosshairs on the lead vehicle. Her breathing slowed to a steady rhythm as years of training took over. The mountains around Volkov had witnessed countless battles throughout history, but none quite like what was about to unfold. A young woman who had learned to shoot rabbits and deer was now preparing to face professional soldiers in her first real combat. The enemy forces below had no idea that their greatest threat sat nearly a kilometer away, hidden among rocks that had sheltered hunters and warriors for generations. Elena's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she waited for her father's signal. Everything she had learned, everything she had practiced had led to this moment. The fate of her village, and perhaps much more, would soon depend on her ability to place shots with deadly precision. Elena felt her heart pounding as she watched the enemy soldiers spread out through her village below. Through her rifle scope, she could see them kicking down doors and searching houses that had been abandoned just hours earlier. Some soldiers were setting up communication equipment near the village center, while others began positioning heavy weapons at key intersections. The radio remained silent as her father waited for the optimal moment to spring their trap. Elena forced herself to breathe slowly and steadily, just as she had been taught during countless hunting expeditions. At this range, even a slight tremor in her hands could cause a shot to miss by several meters. Through her scope, she observed the enemy's tactical movements with growing understanding. These were not elite special forces but regular infantry soldiers who had grown comfortable after days of easy victories against unprepared opponents. They moved carelessly, bunching together in groups and failing to establish proper security perimeters. Elena identified what appeared to be the commanding officer, a tall man with distinctive insignia on his uniform who stood near the radio equipment, pointing at various locations while speaking into a handheld device. Taking out the commander would create confusion and disrupt their coordination, but the shot would also reveal her position to the entire enemy force. Her father's voice finally crackled through the radio. "Eagles perch. You have authorization to engage high-value targets. All other units, wait for my signal after the first shot." Elena adjusted her scope's elevation slightly, accounting for the significant bullet drop over such a long distance. She had practiced these calculations hundreds of times, but never under the pressure of actual combat. The mathematical precision required for long-range shooting demanded absolute focus. Leaving no room for emotion or hesitation, the enemy commander moved into her crosshairs, standing perfectly still as he studied a map with two subordinates. Elena controlled her breathing, allowing her heart rate to slow until she could feel the natural pause between heartbeats. This was the moment her father had taught her to recognize, when the body achieves perfect stillness for a fraction of a second. She squeezed the trigger with smooth, steady pressure, feeling the rifle's familiar recoil against her shoulder. The sound of the shot echoed through the mountain valley, but Elena was already working the bolt action to chamber another round. Through her scope, she saw the enemy commander collapse, causing immediate panic among the soldiers gathered around him. The second shot came 3 seconds later, targeting the radio operator who was frantically trying to report the attack. Elena's bullet struck him center mass, destroying both the soldier and the communication equipment. Without their radio, the enemy unit was effectively cut off from reinforcements and higher command. Chaos erupted in the village below as soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting orders and trying to locate the source of the shots. Elena could see muzzle flashes from other positions as her fellow villagers opened fire with automatic weapons, targeting the confused enemy troops from multiple directions. The remaining enemy soldiers attempted to establish a defensive perimeter, but they were facing an invisible enemy that seemed to strike from everywhere at once. Elena methodically picked off targets of opportunity: soldiers who exposed themselves while trying to direct others, machine gunners attempting to set up their weapons, and anyone who appeared to be taking charge after the loss of their commander. With each shot, Elena felt her confidence growing. The months of preparation and years of training had prepared her well for this moment. She was no longer the village girl who hunted deer for her family's dinner. She had become something far more dangerous. The enemy force tried to mount a counterattack, charging toward the positions where they thought the shots were coming from. This proved to be a fatal mistake, as Elena and the other defenders had carefully planned overlapping fields of fire. Soldiers who advanced toward one position found themselves exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. Elena's fourth shot took down a sergeant who was trying to rally his men for an organized withdrawal. Her fifth shot eliminated a soldier who had managed to get a machine gun operational and was laying down covering fire for his retreating comrades. Each shot was precise and deliberate, placed with the kind of accuracy that comes from years of practice and natural talent. The surviving enemy soldiers finally realized they were facing a well-prepared ambush rather than a chance encounter with local hunters. They began a disorganized retreat toward their vehicles, abandoning wounded comrades and most of their equipment in their haste to escape the killing ground. Elena tracked the fleeing soldiers through her scope, but held her fire as they reached their vehicles and began a hasty evacuation. Her father's voice came through the radio. "All units, cease fire. Let them go. We want survivors to carry word back to their commanders." As the dust settled over the abandoned village, Elena remained in her position for another hour, watching for any signs of returning enemy forces. The tactical situation had changed dramatically in the span of 20 minutes. What had begun as a confident enemy advance had turned into a devastating defeat that would force them to reconsider their entire strategy for controlling the mountain passes. Elena finally allowed herself to relax slightly, though she kept her rifle ready and continued scanning the approaches to the village. Her first engagement with professional soldiers had exceeded even her own expectations. She had successfully engaged targets at extreme range under combat conditions, demonstrating skills that many military snipers would envy. Her father's voice came through the radio again. "Eagle's Perch. Outstanding work. Maintain your position for now. Intelligence reports suggest enemy reinforcements may arrive within hours." Elena acknowledged the message and settled in for a long wait. She had proven herself in her first real battle, but this was only the beginning. The enemy would not underestimate the mountain defenders again, and future engagements would likely be far more challenging. As she cleaned her rifle and prepared fresh ammunition, Elena reflected on how quickly her life had changed. 3 days ago, she had been helping with the harvest and worrying about winter preparations. Now she was a combat sniper responsible for defending her homeland against professional soldiers. The mountains around her had witnessed the birth of a legend, though Elena herself remained unaware of the reputation she was beginning to build. Word of the mysterious sniper who had decimated an entire enemy unit would soon spread through both friendly and enemy forces, creating a psychological impact far beyond the tactical significance of her individual shots. 3 hours after the first engagement, Elena spotted dust clouds on the distant road indicating approaching vehicles. Through her scope, she counted at least 8 military trucks accompanied by armored vehicles, a force nearly 3 times larger than the unit they had just defeated. Word of the ambush had clearly reached enemy headquarters, and they were responding with overwhelming numbers. Elena radioed her observations to her father, who was coordinating the defense from a position near the village center. His response was immediate. "All units prepare for withdrawal to secondary positions. Elena, you have permission to engage targets of opportunity during their advance, then fall back to Rally Point Charlie." The enemy was taking no chances this time. Elena watched through her scope as soldiers dismounted from their vehicles well outside the village and began advancing on foot in proper tactical formation. They moved with the caution of troops who had learned to respect their opponents. Using cover and maintaining proper spacing between individuals, Elena identified what appeared to be their new commander, a stocky officer, who stayed well back from the front lines while directing the advance through hand signals and radio communications. Unlike the previous commander who had exposed himself carelessly, this one understood he was facing a skilled sniper and acted accordingly. The advancing soldiers were also displaying professional discipline, advancing by squads while others provided covering fire from concealed positions. Elena realized these were likely special forces or elite infantry units, far more dangerous than the regular troops they had faced earlier. Despite their improved tactics, the enemy still had to cross open ground to reach the village, and Elena had identified several choke points where advancing soldiers would be forced to expose themselves. She selected her first target, a squad leader who was directing his men's movement across a rocky slope approximately 600 meters away. Elena's shot struck the target precisely, causing the advancing squad to immediately seek cover among the rocks. However, instead of panicking like the previous unit, these soldiers quickly identified the general direction of the shot and began returning suppressing fire toward Elena's position. Bullets began striking the rocks around Eagle's Perch, forcing Elena to keep her head down as chunks of stone flew in all directions. The enemy had quickly estimated her location based on the sound and angle of her shot, demonstrating the kind of tactical competence that made them truly dangerous opponents. Elena waited for the suppressing fire to diminish, then quickly moved to an alternate firing position she had prepared 50 meters away. From this new location, she could see enemy soldiers attempting to flank her original position, unaware that she had already relocated. Her second shot eliminated the lead soldier in the flanking movement, causing the others to dive for cover and call for additional support. Elena could hear the distinctive sound of mortars being fired from the enemy's rear positions, and within seconds explosions began erupting around Eagle's Perch. The mortar barrage was precisely targeted, turning Elena's original hide into a smoking crater filled with pulverized rock and twisted metal. If she had remained in that position, she would certainly have been killed. The enemy's quick and accurate response demonstrated that they had learned valuable lessons from their earlier defeat. Elena realized that her position was becoming untenable. The enemy had sufficient firepower to systematically destroy every potential sniper position on the mountainside, and their mortars could reach any location within several kilometers. It was time to execute the withdrawal plan her father had developed for exactly this situation. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Elena began working her way toward Rally Point Charlie, a concealed position deeper in the mountains where the entire defensive team planned to regroup. She paused periodically to take shots at targets of opportunity, but the enemy was now moving with such caution that clear shots were becoming increasingly rare. As Elena reached the rally point, she found her father and 6 other defenders already waiting in a natural cave system that had been prepared with supplies and ammunition. 3 members of their original team had not arrived, and everyone understood what that meant without speaking about it directly. Her father studied Elena's face carefully as she settled into the cave. "How do you feel about your first real battle?" he asked quietly, away from the others. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I feel different. When I was shooting, it was like hunting, but afterward I realized these were people with families just like us. I know we had to defend our home, but it still feels heavy." Her father nodded approvingly. "That heaviness is important. The day you stop feeling it is the day you become something we're fighting against. But remember, they chose to invade our land. You're protecting innocent people." Through the cave entrance, they could hear explosions and gunfire as the enemy conducted a thorough search of the abandoned village. Radio intercepts suggested they were also bringing in specialized counter-sniper teams and aerial reconnaissance, making any return to their original positions extremely dangerous. Elena's father gathered the remaining defenders around a hand-drawn map of the surrounding mountains. "The enemy has committed significant resources to this area, which means they consider these passes strategically important. Our job now is to make holding this territory so costly that they decide to look for easier routes." He pointed to several locations on the map where they could establish new ambush positions. "We'll operate in smaller teams, hit them when they're not expecting it, and disappear before they can respond. Elena, your long-range capabilities give us options the enemy won't anticipate." Over the next several hours, Elena learned about guerrilla warfare from men who had fought in multiple conflicts. They taught her about patience, about choosing battles she could win, and about the psychological impact of an invisible enemy who could strike without warning. The strategy was simple but effective. Make the enemy afraid to move during daylight hours, force them to expend enormous resources protecting their supply lines, and gradually erode their morale through constant uncertainty. Elena's rifle skills made her the perfect weapon for this kind of warfare. As night fell, Elena prepared for her first mission as part of a guerrilla force rather than a static defense. She would be operating alone, using her intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain to position herself for shots that seemed impossible to the enemy. The young woman who had grown up hunting deer was about to become something far more dangerous, a ghost in the mountains who could kill from distances that defied imagination. The enemy forces below were settling into defensive positions around the village, probably believing they had secured the area. They had no idea that their greatest threat was still out there, watching them through a rifle scope and planning their next move with the patience her father had taught her during countless hunting expeditions. Elena spent 2 days studying the enemy's new defensive positions from various concealed locations throughout the mountains. The invading forces had established a fortified base in her village, complete with sandbag barriers, machine gun nests, and regular patrols. They were clearly planning to use Volkov as a staging area for further advances into the mountain region. Through careful observation, Elena identified the enemy's routine and weaknesses. Supply convoys arrived every morning at approximately 9 o'clock, bringing food, ammunition, and replacement personnel. The guards were most alert during these deliveries, but became complacent during the quiet afternoon hours when nothing usually happened. Elena also noticed that the enemy commander, the cautious officer who had replaced the one she killed, maintained a command post in the village schoolhouse. He appeared briefly each morning to inspect the perimeter defenses, always accompanied by 2 bodyguards and following the same route around the fortified positions. On the 3rd morning, Elena positioned herself on a ridge nearly 1,000 meters from the village. At this extreme range, even her exceptional skills would be tested to their limits. Environmental factors like wind speed, air density, and temperature could all affect bullet trajectory. Enough to turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. Elena spent an hour studying wind patterns by observing how grass and leaves moved at different elevations. Between her position and the target area, she made detailed notes about bullet drop calculations and confirmed her scope's 0 using a distant rock formation. Everything had to be perfect for shots at this distance. The supply convoy arrived precisely on schedule, and Elena watched through her scope as soldiers unloaded supplies and conducted routine security checks. The enemy commander emerged from the schoolhouse exactly 23 minutes after the convoy's arrival, just as he had done on the previous 2 days. Elena tracked the commander through her scope as he began his inspection tour, noting his pace and the predictable route he followed. The challenge was not just hitting a target at extreme range, but timing the shot to catch him in the one location where he would be clearly visible for several seconds. As the commander approached the predetermined position, Elena controlled her breathing and allowed her body to find its natural point of aim. At this distance, she could barely make out individual features through her scope. The target appeared as little more than a uniformed figure moving. Among the defensive positions, Elena's finger tightened on the trigger. As the commander paused to examine a machine gun position, presenting a stationary target for the first time during his inspection, the rifle's recoil surprised her slightly, as it always did during a perfectly executed shot, and she immediately began cycling the bolt to chamber another round. At a distance of 1,000 meters, it took nearly 2 seconds for the bullet to reach its target. Elena watched through her scope as the enemy commander suddenly collapsed, causing immediate confusion among the soldiers around him. She had achieved what many would consider an impossible shot under combat conditions. The second shot was even more challenging, as the remaining soldiers were now diving for cover and moving unpredictably. Elena selected a machine gunner who was attempting to establish a firing position in her general direction. Though at this range he had no hope of accurately returning fire, this shot also found its mark, eliminating the machine gunner and his weapon from the enemy's defensive array. The psychological impact was immediately visible as soldiers abandoned their positions and sought cover inside buildings, afraid to expose themselves to the invisible sniper who could apparently strike from impossible distances. Elena remained motionless for another 10 minutes, watching the chaos she had created through her rifle scope. Enemy soldiers were running between buildings. Officers were shouting orders and medical personnel were attempting to treat the wounded. The entire base had been thrown into confusion by 2 shots from a single hidden marksman. As planned, Elena began a careful withdrawal from her firing position, moving along concealed routes that would prevent the enemy from tracking her location. Even if they had sophisticated equipment for detecting sniper positions, her extreme range made it nearly impossible for them to determine where the shots had originated. The enemy's response was swift and overwhelming. Within 30 minutes, Elena could hear helicopters approaching the mountain area, and radio intercepts indicated they were conducting aerial reconnaissance to locate her position. Mortar rounds began impacting various ridgelines as they attempted to suppress suspected sniper locations. Elena reached a prepared hideout in a dense forest area just as the first helicopter passed overhead. The aircraft was equipped with thermal imaging equipment, forcing her to remain completely motionless under thick tree cover until the search moved to other areas. Radio chatter revealed that the enemy was becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to locate and eliminate the sniper who was terrorizing their forces. They had brought in specialist counter-sniper teams and were considering abandoning the village entirely if the attacks continued. Elena's father met her at a predetermined rendezvous point that evening, bringing news from other resistance groups operating throughout the mountain region. Word of the mysterious female sniper was spreading rapidly, inspiring other civilian fighters and causing concern among enemy commanders across the entire front. "You've become more than just a sniper," her father told her as they shared a simple meal in a hidden cave. "You're becoming a symbol. Enemy soldiers are afraid to show themselves during daylight hours, and their officers are requesting transfers to other sectors." Elena listened to reports from radio intercepts that painted a picture of an enemy force under psychological siege. Soldiers were reporting phantom snipers in areas where no resistance fighters were operating, and normal military activities were being disrupted by constant fear of the next long-range attack. The tactical situation had evolved beyond simple harassment of enemy forces. Elena's extreme range capabilities were creating strategic effects far out of proportion to the number of shots fired. Enemy units were forced to dedicate enormous resources to protection against a single sniper, reducing their effectiveness in other operations. Elena studied intelligence reports about enemy troop movements throughout the region, looking for opportunities to strike targets that would have maximum psychological impact. Her reputation was becoming a weapon in itself, but she knew the enemy would eventually adapt their tactics to counter her threat. The next phase of operations would require even greater skill and cunning, as the enemy was clearly taking the sniper threat seriously and deploying their best personnel to eliminate her. Elena was no longer just defending her village. She had become a strategic asset in a much larger conflict. As she prepared her equipment for the next mission, Elena reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 1 week. The quiet mountain girl who had learned to hunt with her father was now a legendary figure whose actions were being discussed in enemy headquarters hundreds of kilometers away. The enemy's response to Elena's long-range attacks was more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. Intelligence reports revealed they had brought in a specialized counter-sniper unit, led by a decorated marksman named Colonel Viktor Petrov, a veteran who had earned his reputation hunting insurgent snipers in previous conflicts. Elena's father shared the intercepted communications during their evening briefing in a concealed mountain shelter. "They're offering a substantial reward for information leading to your capture or elimination," he told her. "More importantly, they've deployed thermal imaging, drones and acoustic detection equipment, specifically designed to locate sniper positions." The technological escalation meant Elena could no longer rely solely on concealment and distance. She would need to adapt her tactics to counter sophisticated detection systems, while maintaining her ability to strike high-value targets at extreme range. The hunting skills her father had taught her would need to evolve into something far more complex. Elena spent 3 days studying the new security measures the enemy had implemented around their base in Volkov. They had established overlapping patrol patterns, positioned observers with high-powered telescopes on elevated positions, and deployed mobile teams that could respond rapidly to any suspected sniper activity. Colonel Petrov himself was visible through Elena's scope as he conducted inspections of the defensive improvements. The man moved with the confidence of someone who understood the sniper threat intimately, never exposing himself unnecessarily and varying his routines to prevent predictable targeting opportunities. Elena realized that eliminating Petrov would require a completely different approach than her previous engagements. The colonel was too experienced to fall victim to conventional sniper tactics, and his security measures made approach shots from typical ranges extremely dangerous. The solution came from an unexpected source: her childhood knowledge of the mountain cave systems. Elena remembered exploring a series of connected caverns that emerged at various points throughout the valley, including one opening that was less than 400 meters from the enemy base. The cave approach would be incredibly dangerous, requiring Elena to traverse underground passages that had not been mapped or explored in years. However, it would also place her closer to the target than anyone would expect, potentially allowing her to take shots from an angle that bypassed most of the enemy's security measures. Elena prepared for what she knew might be her final mission. If the cave approach failed, or if she was detected during the infiltration, there would be no escape route and no support from other resistance fighters. She would be completely on her own in the heart of enemy-controlled territory. The underground journey took 12 hours, crawling through passages barely wide enough for her body while carrying her rifle and essential equipment. Some sections required her to navigate by touch in complete darkness, following underground streams and air currents to find the correct path. Elena emerged from the cave system just before dawn, finding herself in a position that no enemy security planner had considered. She was inside their defensive perimeter, with clear lines of sight to the command post and other critical facilities. The risk had paid off in the form of tactical opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. Through her scope, Elena could see Colonel Petrov in the command post, studying maps and coordinating with his subordinates. At this range, she could make out facial expressions and individual gestures, details that had been impossible during her previous long-range engagements. Elena waited for the optimal moment, knowing she would have time for only one shot before the entire enemy force converged on her position. Petrov was examining a large map of the mountain region, pointing to various locations while explaining search patterns to his officers. The shot was perfect, striking Petrov's center mass and eliminating the enemy's most experienced counter-sniper specialist. Elena immediately shifted her aim to the communications equipment, destroying the radio systems that would allow the enemy to coordinate a response to her. Attack chaos erupted throughout the enemy base as soldiers scrambled to locate the source of shots that had apparently come from inside their own perimeter. Elena used the confusion to eliminate 2 more high-value targets, and Mir, intelligence officer and the commander of the counter-sniper unit that had been assembled to hunt. Elena's escape through the cave system was a nightmarish journey conducted while enemy forces searched every building and defensive position above ground. She could hear explosions and gunfire as frustrated soldiers fired at shadows and suspected hiding places, unaware that their target had already disappeared underground. The elimination of Colonel Petrov and his team had effects that extended far beyond the tactical situation at Volkov. Enemy commanders throughout the region began requesting transfers, and several units refused orders to patrol areas where the mysterious sniper might be operating. Radio intercepts revealed that enemy headquarters was considering a complete withdrawal from the mountain region, viewing the cost of operations as unsustainable, given the losses they were suffering. The psychological impact of Elena's operations had reached levels that were affecting strategic decision-making at the highest levels. Elena's reputation had grown to mythical proportions among both friendly and enemy forces. Stories circulated about a ghost sniper who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before anyone could respond. The truth was often embellished in the telling, but the core facts were impressive enough without exaggeration. Her father met Elena at their designated rendezvous point with news that changed everything. "The regional commander wants to meet with you," he said. "They're planning a major offensive to push the invaders completely out of our territory, and they want our mountain fighters to play a key role." Elena realized that her individual actions had contributed to a larger strategic shift in the conflict. What had begun as a desperate defense of her village had evolved into operations that were influencing the outcome of a much larger war. The skills her father had taught her for hunting deer had somehow become weapons that could change the fate of nations. As she prepared for what might be the final phase of the conflict, Elena understood that she had become something unprecedented. A civilian marksman whose individual capabilities had achieved strategic effects typically associated with entire military units. The enemy had indeed underestimated the female sniper, and that mistake was about to cost them far more than anyone had imagined. The regional commander, General Mikhail Volkov, was a weathered veteran whose family had given their name to Elena's village generations earlier. He received Elena and her father in a concealed command post established in an abandoned monastery, high in the mountains, surrounded by maps, communication equipment, and the quiet efficiency of a professional military operation. Your actions have created an opportunity we never expected, General Volkov told Elena directly, studying her with the appraising look of someone evaluating a valuable but unpredictable weapon. Enemy forces are withdrawing from 3 mountain passes, and their remaining units are so focused on protecting themselves from sniper attacks that they've become tactically ineffective. Elena listened as the general outlined his plan for a coordinated offensive that would exploit the psychological advantage her operations had created. Regular military units would advance through the passes while specialized teams targeted enemy command and control facilities. Elena's role would be to eliminate specific high-value targets, whose deaths would maximize the disruption to enemy operations. The plan required Elena to make what the general described as the 2 most important shots of the entire campaign. Intelligence had identified the overall enemy commander for the region and his chief of staff, both of whom would be present at a critical planning conference scheduled for the following morning. These men are not just military targets, General Volkov explained, pointing to photographs and detailed intelligence files. They represent the enemy's institutional knowledge of mountain warfare and their strategic planning capabilities. Eliminating both of them simultaneously will create confusion that our offensive can exploit. Elena studied the target area through reconnaissance photographs and satellite imagery. The enemy conference was being held in a heavily fortified compound, nearly 1,500 meters from the closest concealed firing position. At that range, environmental factors would have enormous effects on bullet trajectory, and Elena would need to account for variables that might change between her first and second shots. The technical challenge was unprecedented. Elena would need to eliminate 2 specific individuals within a span of seconds before security forces could react to protect the surviving target. Both shots would need to be perfect, as there would be no opportunity for corrections or follow-up attempts. Elena spent the entire night calculating ballistics data and studying wind patterns around the target area. Her father assisted with the mathematical calculations, while experienced military snipers provided advice about shooting under extreme conditions. Everyone understood that the success or failure of the entire offensive might depend on Elena's ability to place 2 perfect shots at impossible range. Dawn brought ideal weather conditions. Clear skies with minimal wind and excellent visibility. Elena positioned herself in a concealed hide that offered an unobstructed view of the target compound, accompanied by a spotter who would help her identify targets and call wind corrections. Through her scope, Elena could see enemy officers gathering in the compound's main building for their planning conference. The building's large windows provided clear views of the interior, but also meant that targets would be visible for only brief moments as they moved between different areas of the room. At exactly 10 o'clock, the regional commander and his chief of staff took their positions at the head of a large conference table, studying maps while other officers provided briefings. Elena adjusted her scope for the extreme range and settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as she had done countless times before. The first shot traveled for nearly 3 seconds before striking the enemy regional commander precisely in the center of his chest. Elena had already cycled her bolt and acquired her second target before the sound of the first shot reached the compound, causing the chief of staff to look up in confusion just as Elena's crosshairs settled on him. The second shot was even more challenging, as the target was now moving in response to the chaos created by the first impact. Elena led the target slightly, accounting for his movement toward the window, and squeezed the trigger just as he passed through her predicted point of aim. Both targets fell within 5 seconds of each other, creating instant paralysis throughout the enemy command structure. Elena watched through her scope as officers ran frantically around the conference room, attempting to provide medical aid while simultaneously trying to take command of a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Radio intercepts revealed that enemy units throughout the region were requesting instructions from commanders who no longer existed. Some units began withdrawing without orders, while others simply stopped all operations pending clarification of the command structure. Elena's 2 perfect shots had achieved something that entire battalions could not have accomplished through conventional warfare. The enemy's ability to coordinate defensive operations had been eliminated by a single marksman, operating from a distance that defied military convention. General Volkov's offensive began exactly as planned, with friendly forces advancing through mountain passes that should have been heavily defended, but were instead abandoned by confused enemy units. The coordination that Elena had disrupted proved impossible to quickly restore, allowing the offensive to achieve objectives that had seemed unattainable just days earlier. Within 48 hours, enemy forces were in full retreat from the entire mountain region. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable just weeks earlier collapsed under the psychological pressure created by an invisible sniper who could strike key targets from impossible distances. Elena returned to her village to find it liberated, and her fellow citizens beginning the process of rebuilding their homes and lives. The enemy had been driven from their homeland, but the cost of victory was evident in empty houses where neighbors would never return, and in the changed expressions of those who had survived. General Volkov personally presented Elena with recognition for her service, though the exact nature of her contributions would remain classified for security reasons. The official records would never fully capture how a young woman armed with her grandfather's rifle had changed the course of an entire military campaign. Elena's father watched with quiet pride as his daughter was honored for achievements that exceeded anything he could have imagined when he first taught her to shoot. The hunting skills he had passed down through generations had evolved into something that had literally changed history, though Elena herself remained the same quiet, determined person she had always been. As life slowly returned to normal in the mountain villages, Elena resumed her civilian activities while maintaining the skills that had made her legendary. The enemy had indeed underestimated the female sniper, and their defeat served as a permanent reminder that underestimating one's opponents can have consequences far beyond what anyone might expect. The mountains had produced a legend, but more importantly, they had demonstrated that individual courage and skill, properly applied, could achieve results that seemed impossible to those who had never learned the patience and precision that comes from years of practice in pursuit of perfection.